This is the story of whiskey, and I started right here in the heart of Tokyo. Around these streets are bars crammed with people imbibing the amber liquid. It'll be a fascinating journey, so come with me as I tell the story of Scotland's gift to the world. I'm going on a pilgrimage to find out why such a simple drink has come to mean so much.
Hi, my name's Jim, I'm from Scotland.
From the makers to the marketeers, and the chemists to the cocktail makers, and from the Highlands to Hobart in Tasmania. I'll be meeting the people and travelling to the places immersed in Scottish whisky's world story. This is the tale of an ancient craft that became a global colossus. It is the tale of Scotch.
Isn't it grand that this stuff's made in Scotland? Aye, but that's gay too.
I can't shake the feeling that so much of what makes this drink is what surrounds us here in Scotland. There is something about the landscape, about the air itself, some unquantifiable atmosphere that adds its personality to our whisky. Now, it might sound overly romantic, but if the idea of terroir, the effect on a product of its place of origin, can be applied to wine, then why not to Scotch? Some places in Scotland feel to me like the living embodiment of this. What a majestic welcome this epic sweep of landscapes offers. Over here we have rugged, vast Jura with its distinctive parks. And over here we have bountiful Islay, the Queen of the Hebrides. Below is the waters swirling and birling like a witch's cauldron. Islay casts a spell on you, and perhaps that sorcery imbues whisky.
I love the place names on Islay. They are all rooted in fact. You know, you're looking at the sea, the land, nature, topography, and all of these names that are derived from Norse, from Gaelic, from Islay's history, really. Bunnahabhain is at the foot of the river, Bunnahabhain. Port Askaig is Ash Tree Bay. Askvig in Norse means ash tree. And remember, the Lords of the Isles in the 12th, 13th century would come in, sail into Port Askaig and use the ash to repair their knivigs for repairs, which is lovely, lovely part of history. Ardbeg in Gaelic means small headland. Islay means island bent like a bow. So wonderful words and names that are so evocative of the land and the island of Islay, really. 150 years ago in Islay, there were 23 licensed distilleries. A couple of hundred years ago, there were many, many more illicit distilleries. And, you know, the people who made whisky at that time were using the landscape, they were using nature, the topography, they were hiding in caves, they were very cunning about where they would actually make their whisky. So the sense of that in Islay's landscape absolutely prevails, for sure. We feel it on a daily basis.
In many ways, this is seen as the home of whisky. It's the whisky island, isn't it? Do you have a sense of community?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. You know, there are so many people who work at distilleries, but people who have lived at distilleries, generations and generations. So that sense of history within a distillery is very, very strong. And sometimes when we talk about it, you know, the distilleries are here, but the villages and the communities almost predate the distilleries. So when people now come back to Ardbeg or Lagavulin or Laphroaig, you know, they talk about the They talk about the community that they lived in, the school, the shop, the post office. It's not just talking about the distillery. Distillery was part of it, but you have a much broader sense of community.
If you stepped back today and looked at a map of Scotland and said, right, we're going to extensively build 120 factories to make a spirit, economically, what's the most sensible thing to do? Where will we build them? How big will they be? How much will we produce? Well, you wouldn't end up with a map of what you have today. You know, these distilleries are far-flung, they're difficult to travel to, you're reliant on a rural population of staffing. There's lots of things that economically wouldn't be the thing that would necessarily be a suitable and significant driver for investment. But the history of how they've developed and the fact that you have this really fantastic rural diaspora is not only great for Scotch whisky, but it's obviously, you know, great for making it intrinsically part of the country.
This is a cultural product. You know, this comes from us. It comes from Scotland. It's part of our psyche. It's part of our history. And once you begin to factor that in, you know, the importance of whisky to a community, you know, whether you go up to the Highlands, whether you go to Islay or whatever, the importance of whisky to families, to communities, to farming communities, to ancillary industries, to transport, farmers, etc., etc. Suddenly it becomes more than just a product. As soon as whisky becomes a product or a brand, it loses... It's not magic, because magic is kind of ephemeral. Magic is kind of made up. It's a real link to place and a real link to culture.
The whisky industry is strong, it's forceful, and it's built an economy in Islay in this landscape in the 21st century, which is so important for islanders and for locals.
Then it is said, the secret is in the water. And there's plenty of it about in Scotland. Little springs that become clear, clean streams.
This island has to be visited to be understood or even believed. The land gives itself to the whisky, and the whisky keeps Islay alive and vibrant. It produces joyous, ebullient characters who know they have something special going. Jim McEwen is one of Scotland's great distillers and an old pal of mine.
You live in paradise, Jim. Thank you. I realise that.
I know you do. But listen, all these years I've known you, right? And I've interviewed you. There's one question I've never asked you. That's the source of your nickname within the world of whisky, the Cask Whisperer. Now, how did that come about?
I think... I used to talk to casks. That might sound kind of bizarre, but when I was sampling casks, I would put a little bit of whisky in the glass, and I'd look at it and evaluate the colour and the nose and think, you're just not ready yet. I'll see you in 3 months' time. Back the cask. And then you try another one, you say, oh my God, you are ready to go. You're ready, you can fly. So once or twice people have gone past me in the warehouse and said, that guy is drunk. He's talking to himself.
He's talking to the
I was
casks.
actually talking to the cask. Well, each of these bars is one of your children, because you created it. And not myself personally, but myself with a team, you understand?
Yes. No, but you've created many, many fine whiskies
but
over
I
the
mean,
years.
there's a whole bunch of us, the Mashman, Stillman, all that, these sort of guys. So it's a team effort. But you, David, let me tell you something. It's really, really, really simple. If the spirit is the child, then the cask is the mother. If the child, when born, goes into a good cask, you're guaranteed to have a good whisky at the end of it, or a good adult.
I think it is ultimately a combination of nature and nurture. The nature of our landscape, the atmosphere, the humidity, the environment, and the nurture, which is in people's minds.
We, at all three of our distilleries now, we produce a peated style, a limited volume, but a peated style. And if you compare our peated style with Islay, they are actually totally different. The Islay one is drier and saltier, whereas the one in the mainland up at Benriach and at Glendronach and Glenglassaugh, they're actually quite sweet peat. So, you know, the land does play a part. Where the peat comes from plays a part. The environment plays a part. Glenglassaugh's on the coast. It'll have a much different microclimate in the warehouse than it's, say, in the valley at Glendronach, or indeed near Elgin at Benriach.
If landscape does indeed influence taste, then Isla's has been tinting its whisky for longer than is the case elsewhere. It is here, go legends, that some of Scotland's earliest water of life was made.
Here we are at the rather elegant tip of Isla. Sail that way through the mist and you reach Ireland. In the most romantic telling of how whisky came to Scotland, this whole stretch of coastline was a portal through which the ancient Celts arrived to preach the art of distilling. Now, depending on who you ask, we have the Irish, the Romans, the Persians, and even the Chinese to thank for its invention. Whisky's origins are as complex as a fine blend.
This is Finlaggan, in the centre of Isla, once home to the MacDonald clan, Lords of the Isles, and to what is the most likely truth of how distilling reached Scotland. When Angus MacDonald married Princess Anya Nichachan of Ulster in 1300, Anya's entourage brought the art of distilling from Ireland with them. We don't know exactly where or when, but soon these distilling techniques were being employed to make a raw form of whisky here in Scotland for the very first time. Then in the 15th century, a first recorded mention of whisky emerged.
The art of distilling first made it into print in Britain in the Canterbury Tales. A century later, in 1494, came Scotland's first recorded mention, and in it, Friar John Corr, a Fife monk, is listed in King James IV's Exchequer Rolls as having received 8 balls of malt for aquavita. Now that's enough barley to make over 1,000 bottles of whisky, but it's unlikely that Friar John was either Scotland's first or only whisky producer.
Whisky was now trickling its way across Scotland and into the country's customs and identity.
The first real record I think you get of whisky becoming Scottish and kind of part of a Scottish psyche, the first record of that is Martin Martin's account of whisky drinking in the Isle of Lewis, beginning of the 18th century, where he says, and I'll paraphrase here, but he says something along the lines of, when the community, their manner of drinking was called a straich, or a round, because they would sit in a circle and the cup would be passed from one to the other and all would drink until all became drunk. Now, there's kind of 2 ways to look at that. You know, one is that's just people sitting there in the circle in a big ceilidh and getting drunk. But I think when you begin to look deeply into that, you see here is whisky being used as a social lubricant, or as a way for a community to cohere. And here is whisky being used to sort out, to loosen people's tongues, for a community to come together, to say, right, who's getting married, who's going to be ploughing that particular field, who's going to go fishing. And suddenly, I think from that record, you see that whisky isn't just this alien spirit that's used in certain occasions. Whisky is now part of us. It's now part of a Scottish culture.
From fuzzy origins, this simple drink seeped its way into everyday life. Nowhere came to embody the spread of whisky into an area's soul more than Speyside, or to some of us, Strathspey in northeastern Scotland.
The peaty water of life. This is Speyside, the capital of whisky. It's a place of wonder and pilgrimage, a secret zone where the sweet smell of malt seems to hang in the air. And it's almost as if every corner you turn there's a distillery, and in every nook and cranny you will find evidence of the making and the worship of whisky. You know, within 20-mile radius of where I'm standing now, there are about 60 distilleries. I mean, that's almost half the total number in Scotland. And you see, it's more than a whisky region. It's a whisky republic, And I think they should rename it the Amber Republic. It is truly a place of wonder.
If you talk about the Glenlivet to the average Scotsman on Allen Street, his mind goes straight to the Highlands, and he thinks of an old distillery producing the finest whisky distilled in the Highlands. The Glenlivet.
Glenlivet is a Speyside whisky with a foot in both the past and the present. 2 centuries ago, one of countless illicit distilleries on Speyside, it now produces the highest selling single malt in the world. Master distiller Alan Winchester took me for a walk in the hills overlooking this amber realm.
What would this place be like without, we've got what, some 50, 60 distilleries around here?
Well, absolutely.
It's the heart and soul of this country, isn't it?
Yes, it's been very important. It's very important. It goes along with all the traditional. You can see it, farming, forestry, landed estates where you can go fishing and shooting. The whisky distillation really took off here after the 1824 Distilling Act, getting a push with the railways. It's got all the things correct here. It's got bags of peat if you want to make peaty whisky, lots of water, fairly dry climate at the coast, which is ideal for growing barley. So all the magic comes together. And then, as Sir Walter Scott said, the cunning alchemists were based at Glenlivet. That's an important part in making whisky as well.
Cunning alchemists?
Yes. I like that title. If you travel around the world, you find local spirits. And you'll say, why is that spirit not bigger in the world of things? You go to Calvados, you get that apple brandy. You do see it round about. Whisky was this local drink. It was used by great-grandfathers and that to turn a little barley into a bit of cash, you know, add value to it, and it would keep better. It was one of the few agricultural products that improves with keeping with age. You can't keep milk for years. You make cheese to preserve your milk, etc. So it was part of that. And then it was very much woven into the fabric of the country from the early days of distillation. One of the founders of Cragganmore Distillery speaks about 200 illicit stills here. Now that seems a lot, a little stills working away. So there was crofts all around here, small production. So to fill a few anchors, you needed a few of these working. So all these communities were working their little stills, very remote. And also, some of the estates would take whisky as the rent. It would be part of that cash trade.
Just for consumption? For their own personal
or sell on. Because many of the local distillers here were the distillers, and then they handled it on to the smuggler, the other. A distiller was called a smuggler, but a smuggler was the guy who took it to the market. And they were the hard men that would take on the customs, excise, etc. A lot of the ladies did the distilling in the area around here in these 200 illicit stills.
When they smuggled them on land, were they actually carrying casks?
They would strap the casks to the ponies, 2 anchors onto the side of a Highland pony, and away they went. It was maturing all the way to the market.
The smuggling of whisky was a way of life. Scallywag, brazen stories are still proudly told on Speyside. One of my favourite spots here is the Fiddigside Inn in Craigellachie. Joe Brandy married into a family that had been running the pub since 1919 and were shifting whisky less legitimately before that.
Joe, there's a wonderful photograph up there of an interesting character. Who's he?
That was my wife's grandfather, and he was a gamekeeper over in Glass, you know, between Dufftown and Huntly. In a very remote croft there. And he used to make his own whisky. And the customs excise used to go and try to catch him. They would go dressed as tramps and knock at the door. And he would say, oh, come on in. And they thought, oh, well, this is it now. Oh, they were asking for something to warm them up. And they thought he'd produce the whisky, but he didn't. He gave them a bowl of soup instead. But he was finally caught. His boss, the laird over at where he worked, was in a dinner down in London. And unknown to him, sitting next to him was the head of customs and excise. And they said to the head of customs, he didn't know it was him, said, I would get a better dram from a gamekeeper. So they came up and caught him and confiscated all his gear, and he was fined £10.
God, it was just because of an overheard conversation in London.
Yeah, yeah.
Dear me, what? Oh, that's a shame that he was caught out.
Yeah, he was caught out.
So, Joe, when you were a boy, you must have been aware of illegal stills all around this area.
Oh, it's good. A lot. I don't remember much about them at all, but I know there was a lot. Oh, there was a lot in Glenlivet, and they used to go to Inverness for the whisky, but they got word that they were going to be waylaid on the way by the customs and excise, so they hired a hearse, and it was horse in these days, put a coffin in it and put all the whisky into the coffin, and when they passed the customs excise, they took off their bonnets down their bonnet. Well, I took it through.
And you could get a hell of a lot of whisky into a coffin, couldn't you?
A good lot, yeah.
In this region, it feels like whisky is in the soil. While history's more clandestine traditions are gone, some roots remain firm. There are entire whisky generations here, some connected by association and some by family.
Glenfarclas, one of the many distilleries scattered throughout Speyside. Like many places, this seems to inspire an old-fashioned devotion and dedication from the workforce. And I've found that's true right across the whisky industry in Scotland, because everyone I talk to seems to have a passion and a commitment to their work and the craft. And in our cynical 21st century, that's pretty rare. But I guess it helps that, you know, very often the distilleries are family owned, and none more so than this one. Because this is owned by one of the first great whisky families, the Grants, who are now in their 6th generation of custody. George, Glenfarclas is a family affair.
It is indeed.
Is that important to you?
It's the most important thing that we have. I mean, it gives us our most exclusive selling point, our most exclusive advantages over other brands. I mean, in the world today, so many brands are being overtaken by big conglomerates. We're still family owned, still family ran, still very much family hands-on.
And you're determined to keep it that way?
Very much so. Very much so.
So you must be, what, the 6th generation?
I'm the 6th generation of my family to work here.
And you can trace them all back to the very origins.
We do. So it was my great-great-great-grandfather that bought Glenfarclas in 1865 for the princely sum of £511 and 19 shillings.
Away you go.
So we hope it's worth a little bit more now.
I bet it is.
I mean, I'm able to drink whiskey, taste whiskey, sell whiskey that was made by my grandfather, made by my father. You know, it gives you so much passion to it. And then it's not even just the fact that we're family-owned, family-ran. So many people that have worked here for generations as well. So it really is a totally family affair.
But also that means that the whiskey you're producing today will be enjoyed by your children and your grandchildren in years to come.
Well, you see, that's the beauty of it. So any mistakes I make, nobody will find out for a few generations.
You'll be well gone. That's very good. That's what you call passing the buck.
That's it.
How many people do you employ here?
We've got about 35, 36 people here. Some of them have been here for a very long time. We have a gentleman in the still house who's been here for over 42 years.
42 years?
Yeah, he's been here for a while.
So will he get a special bottle or a cask when he retires?
Well, he's one of these people I don't think will retire. But for his 40th anniversary, we gave him a gallon bottle of 40-year-old, which apparently didn't last very long.
It wasn't always as easy to move whisky around as it is now for Glenfarclas and Speyside's many other distilleries. The coming of the railways was momentous for this area.
I'm about to jump aboard the whisky train. I can't wait. I love train journeys, but this has got to be the slowest train journey I've ever taken.
Good afternoon, sir. Can I interest you in a wee dram?
Peter, what are you offering me?
I'm offering you Chivas Regal 18-year-old.
I think that'll do me very nicely, thank you.
Okay.
Scotch.
Thank you.
You have very good health. This railway shunts along as a tourist attraction. It takes day trippers from Duff down to Keith through beautiful Speyside. But it also has a deep meaning to the whisky industry and the flowering of this area as the centre of whisky. Because historically, it was very difficult to get anything in or out of this remote pocket of Scotland. And then suddenly, the tail end of the 19th century, they opened the railway and it became much, much easier to get coal into the area and the best of Strathspey out to the world. And just as in Islay and Campbelltown had used water as their motorway to create their own eras as being the centre of whisky excellence, the railway shifted it here. So these very tracks helped change this area and this industry forever. Here's to the Whisky Railway.
Tourism founded upon history and a vibrant modern whisky industry brings thousands of people to Speyside from every corner of the globe. Some of them never leave, like Tatsuya Minagawa, owner of the Highlander Inn in Craigellachie.
So how long have you been here?
17, 18 years.
17, 18
Stop
years.
counting.
Wow. So what was your passion? Did you come because of the whisky?
Yeah, pure, yeah.
So initially it was the whisky, then you fell in love with the country and the people and you decided to...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's not only whiskey. If it's not only whiskey, I'm living in Tokyo now. Yeah, whiskey, scenery and the people, all mixed together.
Now you're in the heart of Scotch whisky country.
Mm-hmm.
And you're selling Japanese whisky.
Yeah.
Do many people buy it?
Surprisingly, yes.
Really?
It's not cheap stuff. You know, it's quite pricey, some of them. But 10 years ago, it's quite, people say, oh, Japanese whiskey, oh, rubbish. I'm not drinking Scotch. But nowadays, people come here only for Japanese whiskey, some people.
Do you appreciate the differences between Japanese whiskey and Scotch whiskey?
Because Japanese whiskey industry inspired by Scottish whiskey industry. Basically, we learned how to make whiskey from this country. Mm-hmm. So ingredients we use and the method, exactly same Scottish way. So I'm always telling people, you know, champagne come from France, you know, cava from Spain. More or less same ingredients, same principle, right? Both good product. So Japanese whiskey and whiskey from Scotland, pretty much like that.
That's it. You're in a very unique position. You're a man from Japan, from the other side of the world. You grew up in whiskey. You come here, and you're surrounded by whiskey at the heart of whiskey country. So you see it from an outsider's perspective. Do we do enough? Do we appreciate our own whiskey enough? Or does it take someone like you to come from another culture, another language, to come and say to us, hey, look what you have on your doorstep?
I think same happen back home, you know. Young people don't drink sake, you know, drink beer, wine, or cocktail. It's exactly the same as here. Say, some weekend, number of young people, they pretty much drink vodka and Jack Daniel, or maybe pint of lager. So whiskey is, I don't know, you have to be like some sort of certain age to appreciate. Yeah, so I don't know those young people when they grew up, you know, older, maybe they started drinking whiskey.
When they reach the age of wisdom.
Oh, that's a good one.
They will start to drink whiskey.
Yeah.
Yes.
There remains a Speyside institution built upon such wisdom of age. A Victorian grocer blender of whisky and curator of fine malts that continues to thrive.
In 1895, a family opened a grocery store here in a street corner in the heart of Elgin. It was Gordon and MacPhail's. And like the other great whisky families, like the Buchanans and the Walkers, they created a great whisky brand from a corner shop. And as the whisky side of the business expanded, they had the foresight to do deals with the Spanish for their oak and with fellow Scots for their best whisky. So, Gordon and MacPhail's soon became a byword for quality whisky. It's a business rooted in the family, and it still is. Stephen, this shrine to whisky started off as a wee grocer shop on a street corner in the heart of Elgin, didn't it?
Yes, back in 1895, David. Yeah, so a long 100, just coming up to 100, or 121st birthday, in fact. It was James Gordon and John McPhail who started the business with a young apprentice by the name of John Urquhart. And John, who's my great-grandfather, worked his way up through the business very quickly to become a partner by 1911, and 1915 he was sole owner. So the Urquharts have been involved since day one. We've passed the knowledge of whisky down through now 4 generations.
Gordon and McPhail was built on 2 strands of whisky selling. They made blended whiskies, as befitted a grocery store, and bought casks to be matured in their own warehouses, then bottled and sold on. That second strand thrives today.
Wow. Look at that. This is a liquid museum of whisky. It's owned by Gordon and McPhail. There are over 7,000 oak casks here, slowly maturing the whisky inside. And each barrel is stamped with the name of a different distillery. And the idea is that they're brought here for further maturation, so that the aspects of climate and place can add unique flavours to the whisky. Gordon and McPhail's believe it's the wood that makes the whisky, and I think I tend to agree with them. As you see, these casks are a portal into another world.
It's quite something to imagine that once bottled or blended, so much of the liquid gold here will reach markets way beyond these shores. Over 90% of Scotland's whisky is sold outside of the United Kingdom. When Scotland sells its whisky, it sells casks, but also places like Speyside. The marketing of Scotch has long promoted an image of Scotland to the world with triumphant success. No matter how far from reality that image stretches.
A land of beauty and poetry. A land of violence and colour. A part of the world unlike any other in its people, its exciting history, and even its products. Probably the most famous of which is Scotch.
Fusing a sense of the romantic with arresting visuals and novel methods, advertising put this product on the path to global success. In 1898, Dewar's produced the world's earliest filmed advertisement for any product. It was the first major strike by an industry which knew that sales rested on image and communication. The story of Johnny Walker represents Scotland's success in marrying tradition and innovation to take a drink to the world.
This is a life-size figure of the very handsome striding man, Johnny Walker's Red Label, which is the largest selling Scotch whisky in the world. And it's owned by Diageo. Now, Diageo have enough resources to employ 6 archivists, which is extraordinary in itself, and they take great pride in being custodians of the history of some of the major whisky brands over the last 100 years. But more than that, they also contain the image of Scotland as it has changed throughout the world over those hundreds of years. Oh, these wonderful old tomes. Look at the size of them. Great ledgers, all written by hand.
The Diageo archive also includes a temple of bottles.
Christine, this is amazing.
We use this space to show the evolution of our brands from the very earliest bottle and also to look at brands that have come and gone over the years. This is actually our oldest bottle of Johnny Walker. It dates from the 1880s. We don't really know why it has a snake in it. We think it left Scotland without a snake and probably went somewhere in the Far East, where it's not unusual for things that end up in whiskey bottles.
Bizarre.
We're not sure how it ended up back in Scotland, but we actually found it when we were clearing out a space at one of our packaging plants about 12, 13 years ago. So it's amazing what you can still find around in the industry and in the business. So we're always adding to the archive with historical items, but actually we always collect everything that we create today to build the archive of the future. So what I love, one of the things that I love about our archive, it's never going to be complete because we're always going to be adding to it and always telling.
Yeah, it's a
telling
living,
the story.
working, growing archive.
Absolutely, yeah. So this side really shows some of our Johnny Walker collection, our gold label, blue label and green label, but actually around the other side we have red label and black label, and they were introduced in 1909, and the display really shows the evolution from our earliest right through to present day.
Christy, one of the most famous logos and brand marks in the world of whiskey is the Johnny Walker Walking Man.
Yep, the Striding Man. Yeah.
Striding Man.
Yep, so yeah, he's really famous. So wherever you travel around the world, everybody recognises the Striding Man and associates it with Johnny Walker. We've got some bottles where you can see how the Striding Man first appears. So he's actually drawn in 1908. And
1908?
Yeah, so the story goes that the Walkers invited Tom Brown, who was a cartoonist for Punch magazine, to lunch, and he drew the figure on the back of a menu card. But even though it was drawn in 1908, it didn't actually appear on the pack until the 1950s. So here we can see how the Striding Man looked in the 1950s.
Did he change over the years?
He has evolved, yeah. So right from when Tom drew him in 1908 through to the 50s, individual artists drew the figure. And then in more recent times, they've actually modified him, made him a bit more contemporary, and in 1999 we switched the direction in which he was walking.
Why did you do that?
That coincided with the launch of our Keep Walking campaign, which was the first truly global advertising campaign for Johnny Walker, but it was also the advent of the millennium, so it was all about the brand moving into the next century.
In 2009, Diageo and London agency Bartle, Bogle and Hegarty produced this enchanting commercial in which Robert Carlyle delivers the history of Johnny Walker blended whisky in just 6 minutes.
John actually grew up on a farm on the west coast of Scotland, and when he was 14 years old in 1819, his father died, and the decision was taken to sell the farm, and the money that they raised they used to buy a grocery shop, and that's where he started selling and eventually blending his own whiskies.
But young John was smart enough to be lucky. His father's farm, where he was born and raised, was sold, and the proceeds used to open a grocer's.
The John Walker described so vividly by Carlyle was just one of many individual entrepreneurial whisky blenders whose names became brands.
They bought this lovely grocery shop. You know, in the early days, in John's time, it would have sold household products, but also wines and spirits. And we're lucky enough to have this inventory from 1825, which actually tells us what John was selling in the shop at that time.
Back then, all grocers stocked a range of local single malts, but they could be a wee bit inconsistent. For John, that wasn't good enough. He began blending different malts together as a way of offering his customers a consistent, unique product.
So if you think about it, in John's time, he didn't have a brand. So customers would just come into the shop and say, I like this type of whiskey or this type of flavour, and he would make something to suit them. And that's how the whiskey...
Wow, like bespoke whiskey, really?
Yeah, that's how Walker's whiskies started. And it was his son, Alexander, that created the first brand.
Young Alexander wasn't content with being Scotland's biggest blender. Not ambitious enough for him, no. He convinced the ship's captains of Glasgow to act as agents for him and drove the whiskey bearing his father's name across the globe. By 1860, he had developed the square bottle.
They started exporting their whiskey overseas, and it was all about getting more in a crate, less damages, ease of transportation.
200 years later,
striding among the midges of Loch Doine in the Scottish Highlands, Carlyle nailed this one-take wonder at 8 p.m. on the last day of filming.
So how long did the company stay in the family's hands? Until when?
John Walker & Sons became part of the Distillers Company in the 1920s. Johnny Walker and other blending companies like Buchanan's and Whitehorse all became part of the Distillers Company around the same time.
But they kept their autonomy, didn't they?
They certainly did, and at that time we'd moved on to the third generation of Walkers, and they still ran the company even though it was part of this bigger parent company, I guess. One of the things that I love about the archive is we actually have advertising and photographs from most of those export markets. So we can not only tell the great backstory for Johnny Walker, but we then can show how it appears, in Latin America and Asia and out there in the world, and what a huge global success it's become.
From modern era films to ornate printed sketches of old, advertising has been crucial to the expansion of Scotch, whether aficionados like it or not.
The malt whisky snobs seem to see marketing somehow as the demon in the world of whisky. Well, frankly, again, a reality check, no marketing, no Scotch whisky industry. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, the big blending houses pioneered marketing, and they brought in expertise from America in terms of this new science of advertising. They used the very best copywriters, they used the very best artists, and if you visit our archive and look at some of that material, you really need to look at it hard and think about it to understand how brilliantly executed it is. And I think people who do whisky marketing today have a lot to learn from the way it was done 100 years ago, you know. I mean, if you just think, you know, of the number of bottles of Johnny Walker that are sold around the world, and they've got, on the bottom of each bottle, it's got product of Scotland. It's in houses almost everywhere in the world, you know, and that's what people are going to think, Scotland, Scotch.
During the bad days of the 70s, 80s, into the 1990s, marketing was running whisky rather than production. And the marketing and production did not talk to each other. So if you think like back in the 1980s where, you know, sales are going like that, but if you're a marketing director, are you going to turn around to your boss and say, you know, next year, boss, I'm going to be selling less? You'd be at the door. So everybody was saying, no, we're going to sell more. Things will turn around. So you suddenly get production going like that and sales going like that, which you end up with Whisky Loch as a result of that.
Marketing's a very easy thing to have ooh, it's bad. They're doing evil things. My job is to get really nice, amazing whiskies out there for people to drink. So I don't think that's a bad thing.
Graphic designer Jules Acle relocated to Dalwhinnie in the north of Scotland from London. He became captivated by the influence of marketing upon Scotch whisky and turned his fascination into a number of beautifully crafted distillery books.
In it is to be found the sunshine and shadow that chased each other over the billowy cornfield, the hum of the bee, the hope of spring, the breath of May, the carol of the lark, the distant purple heather in the mountain mist, and the wealth of autumn's rich content, all golden with imprisoned light. Absolutely beautiful, Jules, isn't it?
It is.
And that was Tommy Dewar.
Can you imagine drinking the whiskey after reading that? But that really creates an impression about a place, and the story of whiskey is not sold without those stories, those fantastically evocative purple passages of prose, aren't they? Because if we just drink whiskey from a labelless bottle without a brand, it's going to be nice. But if you know the story behind it, the characters who built the distillery and the brand and its location and on top of a moor or somewhere, then you go back to the spirit, don't you?
You do, and it's a much richer experience, yeah.
Yeah, and you enjoy it so much more.
Great brands will have a people story, a place story, and a production story. And Scotch is the best in the world at doing that. So you'll always have either, you know, a distillery founder. Do you know what I mean? There's always, so you can think of it, you can name every Scotch brand and you can tell me there's distillery founders or there's, you know, blender founders, there's a place, there's this beautiful iconic distillery or this area of Scotland full of glens and nooks and crannies and smugglers and harlots. And you'll have a production story and everybody will say, well, there's up to 40 different whiskies in this blend, or well, we make it with the widest copper pot stills in the world. You know, so there's always those things. Those are the bits that actually make it really interesting, because every brand that I've ever worked on, once you find those stories, you love it.
Sometimes you'll see the message being very much about heritage, about the Old Alliance, about the clans, about the piper, about whatever it is. And sometimes you'll purely see it as the brand. And the brand values and what they stand for in terms of character. And and the kind of markets they go to and how they're served as long drinks. And you're a million miles away from tartan and heather and pipes and bagpipes. And sometimes it's not even necessarily known as being Scotch whisky. It's known as being that brand.
Brands are personalities. So if you're a pretentious person, you might like a pretentious brand. We feel affinities to certain brands because they work with us as persons, don't we?
Yes, true.
So here we are in Dalwhinnie, and the whisky has a very appealing story. We're right up in the heather moors, great at the top of the Grampian Mountains, with all those glorious peaks of snowy tops. But if you stop and think about the Dalwhinnie distillery and its product, how much of it actually is of Dalwhinnie? It gets the water from down the burn. The grain is grown miles away. It's malted miles away. The wood that the whiskey's put in the cask, that comes from abroad. But it's manufactured here, put in the casks, and then, well, many of those casks are left down in the central belt. So what is it of Dalwhinnie, you see? It's interesting, isn't it?
But the story's very powerful and very romantic.
It is. You compare that to, say, a chateau, which makes glorious wine and cognacs. They'll have their own land, their vineyards, and they'll make the wines there in the chateau, and then they'll put it in the casks in their cellars, and then they'll bottle it there in the chateau. So it's much more of a provenance story, isn't it? But here it's more like an assemblage, isn't it? It's interesting, isn't it?
It's a really interesting way of looking at it, yeah. But it's been a very successful campaign, the branding of Dalwhinnie.
Yes.
Extremely successful.
Well, that's where design comes along, you see, and creates this story out of what it's got and makes it so appealing and gives it a provenance.
Scotland it's a tiny, tiny place. To have such presence from something that we produce is just phenomenal. So I think it's grown beyond being just a drink. It is something that is about passion, about love, about friendship, about family, and everything else that encompasses that.
Like any image, it's rooted in some sort of a reality, but of course it ignores some of the industrialization that's necessary for the industry. It ignores some of the scale and the picture postcard image that we might have of a little distillery nestled in the glens doesn't necessarily accord with the reality of a mega warehouse somewhere in the lowlands. But there's enough there for us to hang on to and believe in.
My marketing director came in and said, I'd like to replace the capsule. I'd like to replace the ROPP with a cork and capsule. ROPP is a screw top. I'd like to replace that with a cork and capsule. And I said, why? He said, because it's not classy the way it is. And I had a phone call from my brother, and he said, why on earth did you change the screw top to a cork and capsule? And I thought, oh, all my fears are coming. I said, why? What's wrong? He said, well, when it was a screw top, I could open one at night, pour myself a dram before I went to bed. Now, when I pull the cork, it goes, and my wife says, Jack, is that you at the Macallan again?
As advertisers know, whisky creates desire. One modern expression of this is the exponential growth in people buying Scotch for collection and investment. This is McTear's auction house in Glasgow, and I've come to bid for a piece of the action with two men who make a living from doing just that.
So, Andy, what is this? Now, apart from a display case of gorgeous whiskies.
Well, what we've got here is some of the, I guess, the oldest and rarest in the auction. So there's some absolutely fantastic, we'll call the three types of whiskey. So the drinker, the collector, and the investor. So I'm a drinker, a collector, and an investor. But as a collector, I'll buy kind of weird old stuff that I just think is cool, that I just have never seen, or the label's a bit odd. It might cost £20 at auction. I know it's never going to go up in value. I might drink it one day, but it's a collectible. So it's just a kind of different, weird thing.
What makes a difference? Is it the rarity of a whiskey or is it the taste?
that gives it its premium value.
So quality is paramount. Rarity, scarcity, we're looking for all these things. Let's take this age and vintage. So we're looking at this Macallan, and I'm going to pick this one out specifically. My colleague to my left here, David, actually was responsible for the liquid and the bottling of this specific bottle. So David's signature is on every single one of just over 3,000 bottles.
But David, you weren't alive in 1946.
Well, I obviously didn't distill the whisky, but I was lucky enough to work at Macallan during the 1990s, and I was given the kind of task, I suppose, to select the barrels that went into the 1946 vintage, which was a terrific responsibility, great fun doing it, but the one downside was having to sign 3,036 certificates. Took me a whole week to sign all the certificates for these bottles. But it's a wonderful old smoky style of Macallan, very unusual, highly
because Macallan's not a smoky whisky.
It typically is not, but when you look at Macallan pre and post the Second World War, it actually was a smoky whisky when coal was in short supply, and they used peat to actually dry the malted barley back then.
So why did they change? Why did they stop using the peat?
Coal became available again after the Second World War, so they went back to something that was much more fuel efficient.
So what's that? What would that be worth now?
Anything £7,000, maybe even £8,000 a bottle. When it first came out,
joking,
in 1998, I think it was retailing for about £1,575 a bottle.
Shall we head off and spend some money?
Let's do that.
As long as
it's yours.
No way, Andy.
That lot that is going now, a yold and 80 at £80 in that lot there, £80, and it's a way to buy a number for that is 656. 280, 300 bids, any advance at £300, 320 in the back there, any advance at 320, can I see 40, we're at 320 standing, any advance at 320, 340 seated, 360 bid, any advance at 360, 380, 360 here standing, any advance at 360 again, a yold at 360, last chance, 360, 360, and it's 36606, thank you, and it's away at 300.
Would you drink that or hold on to it?
I don't know, let's find out afterwards. Depends how thirsty we get.
After Andy's success, it was my turn to bid. Competition comes not just from those in the room, but from remote online and telephone bidders across the planet.
Can I see 90 again? We're at £80 in the book here. Any advance at 80? Are you all done now? Any advance at £80 in that lot there? 90 with you, sir. Any advance at 90 way at the back? Any advance at 90? Are you all done? At £90 for that lot that is going at 90. Are you all done at 90? £90, thank you. Number 3606.
Result. Well done.
After a morning's hard bidding, Andy, David and I went for lunch to discuss the finer details of whisky valuation, collection and investment.
Now, do you buy and sell these whiskies for yourselves or for other people?
We act as the catalyst in the middle, so we've got a number of buyers that are looking for specific bottles or collections, and we have a number of sellers at any one time. So we're really just a matchmaker, so we bring the two parties together. So certain people might be looking for a collection of rare Macallan or a collection of the rare malts from Diageo, or maybe they're peat freaks and they love Ardbeg and want every single bottle of Ardbeg on the planet. So we help kind of plug those gaps that they might have in their own collection. And sometimes, which is really interesting from our point of view, in recent times, people have come to us as professional investors rather than just kind of amateur collectors. And that's something that's really changed probably in the last 2, 3, 4 years maximum, where people can see value. They've maybe done a little bit of tracking of their own, and they understand that, you know, we've got this incredible database, 146,000 pieces of data now, covering 22,000 different bottles. So it gives us a really powerful piece of insight that obviously people use for a number of different reasons.
And now, David, who are these individuals that you work on behalf of? I know that you can't be indiscreet.
Of
but
course.
Obviously, they have money.
Yes.
They have money to spend and money to burn.
Yes, and most people might expect that it's all Asian money or Chinese money. That's not the case. We've got clients from North America, from Canada, from Europe, from the UK, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. I mean, it really is quite global, and we're kind of surprised at where we get calls from.
What percentage of your clients buy whiskey purely for investment, and which of them buy it purely because they just love whiskey?
The vast majority of the kind of the big old bottles that we are moving at the moment are for collecting and investing. However, we recently sold a collection for just under £500,000 to somebody who opened it and is probably drinking it as we are sat here now.
They've opened and are drinking
Absolutely.
a £500,000 collection of whiskey.
Absolutely.
Now, how many bottles would be involved?
50 bottles exactly. Now this is the interesting thing. We did the similar collection, or the same collection, 3 or 4 years ago to a different buyer, and we sold it for slightly less than that. And this buyer again opened this collection of 50 bottles and drank it with his mates playing snooker. So the answer to the question, does everybody buy for collecting and investing? Absolutely not.
That is really good news, gents, because I think whiskey is for drinking and for enjoying.
We couldn't
agree with you more. It is one of the most delicious nectars available in the history of humankind.
Couldn't agree with you more.
And to buy a bottle or a collection of bottles purely for investment purposes, to me, is immoral.
Yeah, I do.
I know it must be. You know, you're both on a cleft stick because you make a living from it.
Indeed. Yeah. It's kind of half and half, and we've grown up, both of us, drinking whiskey, as well as both of us collect whiskey, and both of us invest in whiskey at the same time. So 3 distinct areas that we focus on, which is drinking, collecting, and investing.
The one thing that I guess worries me particularly is this idea that's taken hold recently that you can invest in whiskey. That whiskey is some kind of an alternative to the stock market, some kind of an alternative to pork belly futures or whatever it might be. Now I have a very firm view on this. Whiskey was made to be drunk and to be enjoyed. Whiskey has no meaning until the moment of its consumption. It is just a glass bottle of cold tea until its destruction. And only in its consumption does it achieve meaning and worth and value.
So, chaps, this is the bottle of Rosebank, 12-year-old, that I bid so successfully for.
Well done, congratulations.
But Andy, you've got a treat for me in that glass, haven't
well,
you?
this is because you've popped your cherry at auction, at whiskey auction. We thought we'd celebrate with something special, so we brought you some Mortlach from 1936
Mortlach
to celebrate with. Please accept that on David and I.
Oh, it's got a wonderful nose. Sludge.
The pursuit of Scotch is full of surprises. I never expected to be drinking a 1936 Mortlach in a Glasgow car park.
How much would this cost a bottle?
£3,500 at the moment if you buy it retail.
£3.5 grand?
Yeah.
You haven't poured me a big enough dram.
You've got the last. That's it. Run out.
The first whiskey experience that I vaguely remember was in Studland Beach in England. I was over working in a pub for the summer, and I decided to join some of my new friends for a night out. I was about 18, and let's just say I decided after that night that I would never drink whiskey again.
I remember the first one that I tasted and hated when I was very young was on a camping trip with my dad. And I think we were in Jedburgh, and he'd brought a hip flask of Highland Park, which is one of his favourite whiskies, along with him, and I took a sip of it and just thought it was disgusting.
It was a Lagavulin, and I assumed that all whiskey was really smoky and peaty, and I absolutely loved it. I completely fell in love with it. It was actually the point that changed my life.
Next time, I'll be visiting a spellbinding whisky collection, then assessing the rise of craft distilleries and the future of Scotch. But most importantly, I'm heading to Norfolk, Sweden, Japan and Australia to meet our whisky rivals.
Kirsty Wark counts down our top 10 literary titles with guests including Nicola Sturgeon, Susan Calman and Dame Evelyn Glennie. Find out what's Scotland's favourite book, available now in the Scotland category on BBC iPlayer.